So, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Jeffrey Kennedy is Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Arts and Performance and American Theater History at Arizona State University. Dr. Kennedy is a published scholar and frequent conference speaker on the Provincetown Players and Eugene O'Neill, and his new book titled Staging America, The Artistic Legacy of George CRAM Cook and the Provincetown Players will be released in 2022. Can't wait. Kennedy was recently awarded a Fulbright Scholar Award and is on the board of the Eugene O'Neill International Society, among other O'Neill-related sites. Kennedy is also the creator of www.provincetownplayhouse.com. I will put that link in the chat. It is an award-winning research site about the Provincetown Players and Playhouse. He has a long career working as a professional in theater, as a director and music director, and is a member of Actors Equity. So Jeff, welcome. Thank you so much. Take us away.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you all and talk about my favorite thing in the world, which is the Provincetown Players. How I began to be involved in the Provincetown Players as I was a PhD student at NYU and in the educational theater program. And while I was a teaching fellow, we were told that the Provincetown Playhouse was going to be refurbished by the university. This was in 1997, and that our program would be using it. And I was asked to write a couple of newsletter articles about it, and that started me on the history. And it turned out one article wasn't enough. I needed to write two to get even a little bit of it in. And I just got excited about it. And as time went on, it became evident that I was going to be involved in creating a gallery inside the Provincetown Playhouse. The refurbished, that was going to be about the history. I was asked to do that, and then ended up writing a 27-page monograph that also told the history that was given to guests at the Playhouse, and started giving tours of the Playhouse. Then when they were doing the refurbishment, I was there that whole summer watching them tear things down, finding programs in the slats, finding the ring where the horses used to be tied up when it was a stable, all of these different things. And so it's been part of my life in a huge way. I live just a few blocks away from there. And so as often as I could be there, I started the New Plays for Young Audiences series with Lowell Swartzell, who was my professor and boss at the time. And we started that, and that series in June is still continuing now after 21 years. And so I have a real, obviously, deep connection to the Provincetown Playhouse. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about the Players. And I say that specific because the Players only existed for 7 years in the Playhouse. They created the Playhouse, but they were only there for 7 years on MacDougal Street. And so I'm only going to cover that piece of it today. I wrote a very, very long book and still only cover that much. I hope to write another book after that from 1922 on, because the history of the Playhouse continues to be completely fascinating even after the Players leave. So much about experiment, even some of the early experimental film in America. Maya Duran and others rented the theater because they saw it as a beacon of experimentalization in the village. And it also was there in the heart of the village in so many ways. And so, anyways, I've created a PowerPoint so that I can do two things. One is keep me moving. There's just too many stories I know, and I want to be done in time and to be able to take some of your questions and have a little discussion. But also, so you can see the historical photos that I have. And so let's begin. I'm going to start right off. I want to let you know the why of the Players in terms of how did the Players begin, but even more importantly, why did they begin? What was it about the Players that was so important for them to become this amateur group and keep it going? So my talk today is called Performing the Heart of the Nation, the Provincetown Players. Ariel said that the title of my book is Staging America. And I believe that that's what George CRAM Cook was trying to do. Now, the legacy of the Provincetown Players has continued for many, many decades since they closed as the Players in 1922. Here are some quotes from historians. The Provincetown Players left a legacy unparalleled in the history of American theater by Mary C. Henderson. The summer of 1916, when the Players solidified their existence, may well have been the most important few weeks in the history of the American theater, and certainly remains exceptional even in the much broader perspective of American modernism. That's Robert Crendon, a wonderful Village historian. The Players were the birth of an experimental art theater upon whose foundation so many of our later companies would stand. Todd London with New Dramatist. On November 3rd, 1916, Bounties for Cardiff opened not only the first New York season of the Provincetown Players, but it also the history of the 20th century American drama. And that is by theater scholar Bigsby. And last but certainly not least, William Archer, a critic, maybe one of the most respected both British and American critics of the time. He wrote, "It is in the hallowed ground in the region of Washington Square or Greenwich Village, or among the sand dunes of Cape Cod, we must look for the real birthplace of the American drama." So those are some pretty good comments about its legacy and to justify the continued looking at the history. The gentleman who was at the core of this and who sometimes can be the unsung hero, because we all know Eugene O'Neill began his career here. George Cram Cook's wife, Susan Glaspell, began her career here. And so sometimes that because their careers were so unbelievably dynamic and affecting, particularly during this time in the Village, Cook sometimes is not recognized. And he also had a problem in that he saw things that didn't continue as failures. And so he wrote in his legacy that he had failed when they ended. And yet, of course, if the Provincetown Players are as significant as all the folks we just read say, then of course Cook didn't fail. He just felt a sense of failure as he was moving to the next thing. And he did that often in his life and was very successful at many things. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He was the founder of the Provincetown Players in 1915. That was their first summer in Provincetown, Massachusetts. He was born in Davenport, Iowa in 1873 to a prominent family of lawyers and bankers. But his mother steeped his life in the arts and all things Greek. And that was an interesting part of his life. It's a boy from literally their house was next to the Mississippi in Buffalo, Iowa. And yet, because of her interests in spiritual things and in the legacy of Greek antiquity, he grew up with all this as part of his life and never lost it as an interest, and died in Delphi, Greek, in fact, near the Temple of Apollo. He begins at the State University of Iowa, later known as the University of Iowa now, at 15 years old. He was so ahead, and yet he couldn't do traditional schools, interestingly, and so at 15, after passing all the high school tests through a tutor, he was allowed to start at the State University of Iowa. So he's a smart guy. He starts a student literary group in a workshop style of reading work and then having it critiqued by the group. This was not something that was done until Cook kind of arranges it at this school. What's interesting, then he goes off to Harvard for just 1 year, his senior year, and he studies writing with the famous Barrett Wendell, who really literally changed the way that we study writing and composition as something of its own rather than in service to all of the other subjects. And he was only 2 years when Cook got there at Harvard. And then he studied Greek antiquity with Charles Eliot Norton. Didn't get too much better than that. He returns to the State University of Iowa to teach English and begins, I need to learn how to spell there, he begins a creative writing course in the workshop style. And this style of course is now, all the historians of the Iowa Writers Workshop credit Cook as being the one who started this, and the Iowa Writers Institute which is now the most prestigious and has been for decades, the most prestigious writing program in the country in creative writing. So Cook's legacy of working with writers begins way earlier than anyone had given him credit. And that's an important fact when you understand what he tried to do with the Provincetown Players. Cook then teaches English at Stanford for a year. But he very quickly becomes disillusioned with all of the academic pitfalls of new ideas and wanting to teach innovatively. Now, he writes 3 successful novels in the more romantic style, although he has political points of view, very much a socialist point of view at one point, very much a Nietzschean point of view at one point. So they were contemporary in that way, but they still stylistically were very much of the romantic style. He becomes the associate editor then of the Chicago Literary Review with his friend Floyd Dell as the editor. And Maurice Brown in Chicago credited Cook as patiently trying to teach Chicagoans their literary alphabet through the columns of the Evening Post, and claimed that thousands bought the books which Cook ordered them to buy. The Friday Literary Review was literally the beginnings of criticism of modern literature in America. And the literary style at that time was changing to the realistic but poetic modern style, led by the writing of authors like Theodore Dreiser, who ends up coming to the Village, Upton Sinclair, and Sherwood Anderson, who also ends up coming to the Village. And then Cook has this monumental epiphany when on February 6, 1912, he's in Chicago and he attends a performance of the Irish Players from the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. Now, this was kind of a fraught possibility of going to see the Irish Players in Chicago in 1912. They were from the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and this was their first American tour. But as they went from city to city, first in Boston, then New York, then Philadelphia, some of you may know, they caused a major disturbance. There were literally almost riots in each of these cities with their play, Playboy of the Western World by John Millington Synge. Irish Americans had rejected the play's plot of a young man trying to impress a young woman by boasting he had killed his father, even though it's kind of a comedy, and even in a slightly comic content. And so they claimed a true Irishman would never do such a despicable thing. And so they protested at the prior city's performances. Everything from stink bombs being thrown on stage, people yelling at the actors, all of these different things. And so they kind of put together a little militia in Chicago in fear of what might happen. There was a lot of discussion in the newspapers for weeks about this in anticipation of them finally doing Playboy of the Western World. They did plenty of other plays as well, but it was Playboy they were all worried about. So Cook was invited to be part of a secret posse who was distributed through the theater in case of trouble in Chicago's Hamlin's Grand Opera House. But instead of a disturbance, nothing but ripples of amusement and loud applause were heard. So there wasn't the anticipation. There was a certain excitement about, oh, maybe there's going to be a riot tonight. That hadn't really happened in Chicago in their theaters. But once that became clear it wasn't going to happen that way, Cook became riveted by what he saw on the stage. And this was the most important aspect of this and why I bothered to tell you this in detail. Cook saw, as he would say, no stage conventions in the way. In other words, he was referring to the lack of melodramatic style in this Irish style. Instead, he saw the Irish players using a more naturalistic approach to acting, rarely seen on American stages. American stages were kind of more of a British style, a little more presentational, pretty dramatic with gestures, this kind of thing. And yet, and that's a picture to the side of one of their early plays. You notice how simple as well all of the settings are. And this would also be a characteristic of the new stagecraft in New York City and by Robert Edmond Jones. This kind of simple thing that really drew people to the story and the script itself. Cook also saw that emotions that were conveyed by the actors were projected with the humility of true feeling. In other words, authenticity. What remains are the playwright's words in a purer state. Well, for somebody who cared about writing, particularly increasing modern style of writing in America, and finding an identity which America did not have on its stage yet. It was still very British, very melodramatic. It just didn't have any kind of American, if you will, qualities or characteristics. And this was what Cook was intent on doing and seeing in the theater. Now, you see a picture there on the bottom right. That's Lady Gregory, the Irish player's 61-year-old manager and playwright, who was traveling with them. And they, Maurice Brown, who ended up starting the Little Theater in Chicago, and Cook and Glaspell went to her and asked her about starting theater groups. And she said to them, by all means, start your own theater, but make it in your own image. Don't engage professional players. They've all been spoiled for your purpose. Engage and train, as we of the Abbey have done, amateurs, shop girls, school teachers, counter jumpers, cutthroat thieves, rather than professionals. And then she added, and prepare to have your hearts broken. Quite possibly, Susan Glaspell said, there would have been no Provincetown players had there not been the Irish players. What he saw done for Irish life, he wanted for American life. No stage conventions in the way of projecting, with the humility of true feeling. And so this is the why of the Provincetown players. That Cook wanted to be instrumental in helping writers create a truly American theater. That's a picture of Glaspell and Cook up there on the top. Cook married writer and fellow Davenport resident Susan Glaspell, his third marriage, in 1913, and they moved to Greenwich Village to start their new life together. However, the summer before and for their honeymoon, the couple had discovered Provincetown on the tip of Cape Cod through writer Mary Heaton Vorse, and that's Mary there in the bottom right. Provincetown was a Portuguese fishing village, but artist Charles Hawthorne had discovered it in 1898, and he began teaching plein air art courses. They loved the light that was there in Provincetown because of its proximity to the bay, and they taught classes on the beaches and on the piers. And that started in 1898 and grew, and more artists came and more artists taught during this time. Now, Mary Vorse, a writer whose journalistic work focused on labor issues, had first visited in 1906, and she quickly fell in love with the town. She was an evangelist to friends about coming there, and soon a group of regulars was formed. Vorse and husband Joe O'Brien, who was a journalist, writer Wilbur Daniel Steele and his wife Margaret, who was a painter, writers Hutchins Hapgood and Neath Boyce, and joining them last then in 1912 for the first time was Cook and Glaspell. And they just found a home with each other. They loved being with each other. They were of the same generation. They were all writers. The regulars were not only literary leaders in the country, they literally were these folks, but some of the most politically radical and intelligent minds of their time. Fred Boyd, the British Marxist who served as a secretary to John Reed, said of those in Provincetown in 1914, by a fortunate accident, we happen to have assembled here the brains of America. I love that quote. The reality is that these folks were finding a simple life together, enjoying working during the day and being together at night. Some of them had children that played together. They would cook together. They would help each other. It was a very sane and regular and very peaceful life in Provincetown. And that has everything to do with why Cook was eventually successful in starting something there. Now, they begin in 1915. That picture to the right is of some of the group there. Hippolyte Havel, Mary Vorse. You see Glaspell there on the far left sitting. Hutchins Hapgood looking straight ahead with the hat on. They all were part of this kind of group that, I've coined calling them the regulars, because they were always there and continue to always be there. Mary Vorse had bought a house there, and was there until the 60s when she passed. Now, Greenwich Village had become the center for new theatrical activities, beginning with Floyd Dell's plays presented at the Liberal Club, and then the Washington Square Players, both looking for alternatives to the melodramas or kind of the affair-based triangle plays on Broadway. If they weren't doing Shakespeare, this is what they were doing. American playwrights were kind of stuck and didn't know stylistically how to move towards what was going on in Europe with Ibsen, Strindberg, and others. We didn't have any equivalent here in the United States. Neath Boyce had written a play called Constancy, which was based on the breakup of John Reed and Mabel Dodge, who'd been a couple, and that had been rejected by various theater groups. Cook and Glaspell had also written a satire on Freudian dream interpretation called Suppressed Desires that had also been rejected by the Washington Square Players. Without these rejections, I would dare say the Provincetown Players may never have started. It was an impetus for them to just do these casually in Provincetown. So though Cook had attempted to participate with these other groups, their lack of commitment to creating new American plays disappointed him. So Boyce, on her own, and she's never given her due. She really was at the forefront of starting everything that went on in Provincetown. Boyce organized a reading of her play in her home with her friends, and then decided to stage an informal performance a couple weeks later. And they added Cook and Glaspell's play to the bill, with the settings arranged in Hapgood Boyce's home by set designer Robert Edmund Jones, who was there vacationing. One of the plays was on their deck facing the ocean, and then Suppressed Desire, as soon as Constancy was over, everybody picked up their chairs, turned them around, and now they're facing the living room for the second play. Not only did Cook and Glaspell enjoy their experience, they played the two leads in their play, but friends who weren't invited to attend heard about the performance the next day and wanted to see the plays. Like they were like, hurt. They they were not happy that they didn't get to see what this small group of friends had seen. So Mary Hayton Vorse had just a couple of weeks before all of this happened, purchased Lewis Wharf. Why does somebody purchase a wharf? Nobody's ever asked that question for some reason in the histories I've read all of these years. It's because, see the house to the left? That house was part of the deal. It was a chandlery, which is a place where you buy shipping supplies for boats and everyone. But the whaling and shipping industry in Provincetown had pretty much given up, and because now electricity allowed for ice houses and refrigeration and all of these things. And so they didn't need the wharves quite in the same way. And so Lewis Wharf, which had existed almost about 80 years at that point, she saw it was for sale and that it came with that house, which ended up being the house, by the way, of John Dos Passos. And so it's still there. It's still an amazing place. And so she thought it'd be a great oceanfront home someday. She already had a home down the street, but it was across the street, not right on the ocean. And so she had bought this, but the morning after the plays, Cook went right to her house and asked if they could use the fish house, which is the largest building there in the center of that photo, on her wharf to perform their plays for others. Well, they did that. And this led to two more plays being written and performed. Change Your Style by Cook. He wrote a play about the modern versus the Charles Hawthorne, more in the Impressionist style painters, and kind of the war of styles there in Provincetown, very much an in-house kind of a thing. And Contemporaries by Wilbur Daniel Steele, which was about the Tenenbaum arrest in the village the year before, when he had tried to lead some homeless and folks who needed food into a church. Unfortunately, the priest there in the village was working with the police, and they were all arrested. And Tenenbaum was sent to jail for a year. He was part of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and who were much hated by some, and the judge really threw the whole book at him. And so Steele wrote a play about that, likening him unto Christ. And the masses did the same thing in there. So it was kind of a whole theme of what had taken place. Cook began to sense that this group might be this thing he was looking for, that he was looking to invest his life into. He had just quit after writing the New York letter for the Chicago Literary Review. And so he was looking for his next thing. He was in his 40s. And so creating new American plays in the modern styles, and all of his trajectory from when he started that workshop for writers, leaving a space for writers, to being a critical review, being a writer himself, being a critic of writing, and then moving now into plays. He hadn't written plays before this, but they were attempting to do something that was different. They also were using kind of the aesthetic ideas of the visual artists that had all had to come home from Europe because of World War I starting over there. And so all of this kind of creates an amalgam that is very much an American experiment. that in between 1915 and 1916, he evangelized in the village that winter, particularly gaining the interest of John Reed. John Reed was a famous journalist at that point and poet. He had also staged the Patterson strike pageant at Madison Square Garden, where he had close to 1,400 people who had been in the actual strike in Paterson, New Jersey, restage what had taken place, where unfortunately some were killed, again, some of the protesters by police, and they restaged this whole thing on the huge stage. And it was the kind of the first political theater in America as well. So the group that ventured to Provincetown in the summer of 1916, after all this evangelism, in between of getting people to come up there and become part of it, included artists from Europe, as I mentioned, who had returned to America because of the war. So a large group of villagers summered in 1916, most inspired by Cook to participate in this new theater group. Reed invited a young, unproduced playwright to join them named Eugene O'Neill. Despite legends to the contrary, however, O'Neill came to Provincetown with the hope of the group producing his plays. He wasn't discovered anonymously, willy-nilly. He knew Reed had invited him. Plus, he was having kind of a romanticized affair, some dispute whether it even became a sexualized affair, no one knows for sure, with Reed's new partner, Louise Bryant, who had just moved there from Portland, Oregon, where he had met her. That was his hometown. And but they had a very open, that was part of the milieu, the village at that time was open relationships, free love, if you would. And as much as Louise Bryant is talked about having these many affairs, Reed had them when he was out of town on all of his many, many journalistic assignments. And so despite these legends to the contrary, O'Neill came to Provincetown with the hope of the group producing his plays. However, his first works he showed them were actually rejected by the group. That surprises some people, because when you read Susan Glaspell's kind of dramatized account of what took place, you know, the first time they read one of his plays, they know, oh, you know, this is it, everything. That's just not how it worked. He had many of his early plays that were self-published in a book his father had paid for, the actor James O'Neill. They were rejected by the group. And so, you know, it didn't just happen as easy as it's all said. However, when in July of 1916, he read them his play, Bound East for Cardiff, which is about a sailor who has had a bad fall on board the ship and is dying while reminiscing with his best friend. Then Glaspell responded, this we can believe. They knew what they were for. It was in a language that they'd never heard before. It was real talk, if you will. And some of the sailors who were from different countries had accents, and they spoke like sailors. It wasn't theater talk. And it was something no one had ever heard before, much less the tragedy without a lot of action, other than there was a storm. And so everybody had their duties. And in the center of this are these two men, one dying from this fall, his best friend, as they reminisce. So they opened 3 bills of plays, but not before there was almost a tragedy that would have stopped everything. A fire, and that's a picture, if you can believe it. Somehow someone took a picture and it was in the Provincetown Advocate. A week before they opened, it almost destroyed their theater. What had happened is that larger, taller building in the back there had been rented to an art group from the village that was teaching modern art there, and she got a little too close to a fire with some cleaning fluid on the costumes, and it immediately set the whole place on fire. And basically that entire building you didn't see in the other photo I showed you, and it goes away forever. But they put in a new curtain. They painted the other walls black so they looked the same, and they opened on July 13th with 3 new plays. By the way, those photos down there, that's O'Neill on the left and John Reed, and then that's Charles Demuth, the famous modern artist, and O'Neill, all in 1916 there, all dressed for the beach in Provincetown. Here's a photo of Bound East for Cardiff. You see George Cram Cook laying there on the left on the front bunk. He played the dying sailor. David Karb, who's taking his pulse. He's the captain. Frederick Burt, the professional actor who's standing there. He played Driscoll. And then O'Neill had the shortest amount of lines, but somehow somebody was smart enough to take a picture. He literally was on stage about 20 seconds, but there he is as the second mate. Instead, they say he stood behind the set there. You could hear him breathing heavily because he was so nervous, but there was only one script, so he had it there to prompt them in case they wanted it. That's a fish house floor down there, folks, and that was what they turned into a theater. Here is O'Neill's play Thirst. Not an amazing play, but there were a lot of plays about shipwrecks after the Titanic in 1912, and O'Neill wrote one, but this was not set in the cold, it was set in the heat. That's Louise Bryant on the left, George CRAM Cook in the middle, and they tried to make it seem like they were at sea on a raft. O'Neill plays a mulatto sailor who actually, because he's so hungry, considers eating Louise Bryant at one point. And so the businessman who's there, George CRAM Cook, pushes her into the water so he can't do it. Quite a play. Here is Enemies. That is Hutchins Hapgood on the left. That's Neath Boyce. And you can see the back door open. That's the sea back there in the back. You see the end of the wharf, and then you can see the waves of the sea back there, and the moon, if you look careful. And I love this photo because it gives you a chance to really see how small and very humble this place was. But they made it work, and people there in Provincetown loved it. So that summer, the summer in the plays included Winter's Night by Neath Boyce, Freedom by John Reed, Bounties for Cardiff by Eugene O'Neill, Not Smart by Wilbur Daniel Steele, The Game by Louise Bryant, The Eternal Quadrangle by John Reed, Thirst by Eugene O'Neill, and Enemies by Hutchins Hapgood and then Neath Boyce. Now, Cook did something that husbands I don't recommend, but nonetheless, it worked. He announced without asking his wife, Susan Glaspell, he announced that she was writing a play. He forgot to tell her, however. And the result, however, in the end, there's a long story in there. I don't have time to tell you, but the result was Trifles. Based on a murder incident that Glaspell had covered as a reporter in Iowa. The play is the most anthologized American one-act play and is hailed as one of the early feminist plays in America. This set Glaspell on a new course as a playwright. She had written some minor things while with some local groups in Davenport, but otherwise, this is the beginning of her career as a playwright. She ends up winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1931 for her play Allison's House. So it was a good path to set her on. At the end of the summer, Cook and Reed felt strongly over Glaspell's objection. She thought it was a terrible idea that they should organize formally and create a theater dedicated to producing new American plays in New York City. So a constitution was created with their style of governance similar to the revolutionary magazine The Masses, which meant all the members were involved in selecting plays and making decisions for the company. That lasted about 2-3 months, folks, because people got tired. They had stuff to do. They didn't want to do that. And it ended up being done by committees of small committed people to the Provincetown Players. The Playwrights Theater, its first iteration, some don't know this, is not the Provincetown Playhouse at 133 MacDougal, but 3 houses down, as it was back then, at 139 MacDougal Street. They rented a first-floor parlor apartment at 139 MacDougal from Mrs. Jenny Bellardi, who also owned the 4 other apartments down in that row house. The apartment was a 1840 brownstone, whose 2 doors down from the Liberal Club and Polly's Restaurant at 135. That's been discovered, by the way, all these years. Every history you read until now has said that those were at 137. They were not. We have found more than enough evidence in terms of stationery from the Liberal Club and other people that they were, and also Polly's history of Polly Holiday's of her restaurant, that it was at 135. Historians love this stuff. And the Washington Square Bookshop was next door instead at 137. It's always been described as the opposite. The group constructed a 10.5 by 14-foot stage. You need to know how small that is. I'm going to show you a picture in a moment. And added wooden benches to seat about 140. The benches were said to be the most uncomfortable benches in the world, that they could cut off your circulation just leaning against them. They had great financial luck when the Stage Society of New York decided to buy 400 subscriptions after John Reed went to them and told them of their intent to be an experimental theater company. They didn't know how they had $300 in their pocket when they left Provincetown. And to have this happen changed their lives. And it's one of the reasons that piece of luck made them successful almost immediately. So they decided to present bills of one-act plays, 3 at a time, giving 5 performances from Fridays to Tuesdays, just 5 performances, and then they were done with that bill. They opened their first bill on November 3rd, 1916, presenting Floyd Dell's satire King Arthur Socks, which was similar, and told people, look, we know about Dell's plays. He's part of our group. We know you love them because they make fun of you, right? There's inside satirical jokes and about the village and village mores, and so Cook wisely programmed it. Louise Bryant's The Game and O'Neill's Bounties, both of which have been in Provincetown. The third bill of that year featured a unique and experimental verse drama by Imagist poet and editor Alfred Cranberg titled Lima Beans, as well as O'Neill's monologue play Before Breakfast. They weren't sure what experiment meant. Most of the group thought experiment meant subject matter. But people like Reed, who actually put his entire membership on the line, he said, if you don't do Cranberg's play, which nobody else wanted to do, if you don't do Cranberg's play, I'm quitting your group. Because Cranberg was playing with structure, syntax, rhythm, all kinds of avant-garde things. And that brought in the Ahrensburg group. You've got Marcel Duchamp at these plays. You've got Albert Glazy's at these plays. You've got all of those avant-garde folks that were hovered around the Ahrensburg group. They start to come to see the plays because of that. Here's a photo of them trying to cover the ceiling of that parlor apartment so it looks like a theater. That's the set for Bound East. You notice the gentleman holding up O'Neill because he was probably drunk and needed to be. There on the left on the ladder, you've got many of the cast of Bound East, which was an all-male cast. This is the set for, this was done there at 139 MacDougal of The Game. Notice that the backdrop is painted by Marguerite Zorak, one of the famous modern artists, American modern artists of the time. And in fact, she and William, her husband, had been celebrated by having their works in the Armory Show in 1913, and were really excited to kind of participate, but they wanted to do the more avant-garde, not the realistic stuff. Now, here's one of the great photos in the world. There's only one. This is them doing a play called The Dollar by David Pinsky, who we are assuming is the gentleman on the left. It looks like pictures of Pinsky. And then we have Anita Moyes, who is their first director. On the right, there's those infamous benches that they said could kill you. And look how small that is. Everyone had to enter from one side. That is a small stage. And then when you add the Zorak set to that, as beautiful of a picture as it makes, you've got a lot of people trying to move in a very, very small place. But that's an amazing photo to let you know what it looked like inside 139. Though these new plays were fulfilling the experimental nature of their stated mission, the group almost folded by Christmas, within 3 months, when they ran out of quality new plays and found the interest waning of their larger membership in company decisions. The acting of the company was decidedly amateur, and they were somewhat saved in this by the directorial leadership of Nina Moyes, that's Nina to the right, who had studied acting and began to give shape and clarity to the staging of the plays after she joined them in the beginning of 1917. Though these new plays were fulfilling the experimental nature of their stated mission, the group almost folded, like I said, by Christmas when they ran out. Edna St. Vincent Millay, fresh from Vassar, and with notoriety as an emerging poet, auditioned as an actress for the company and was cast. A few years later, her role would change to promising young playwright after her anti-war allegory, Aria da Capo, was produced. Alexander Wolcott called it the greatest American play that existed at the time. In those first 2 years, O'Neill had 6 new plays presented: Before Breakfast, Fog, The Sniper, Isle, which is the New England pronunciation of oil, The Long Voyage Home, and The Rope. Glaspell had 4 plays produced: Trifles, The People, Close the Book, and Women's Honor. The Provincetown's first full-length play was given in April 1918, The Athenian Women by George CRAM Cook, and the audience on opening night was political activist Emma Goldman, a frequent visitor whose niece and nephew-in-law were involved in the group. Goldman brought with her that evening her friend and colleague in political activities, Mary Eleanor Fitzgerald. That's Fitzy there on the left. Fitzgerald eventually became the business manager of the Provincetown and one of the company's few paid employees who remained at the helm through 2 more iterations of the Provincetown Players after 1922 until 1929. Here is the Zorach's really unique play. This is a very unique photo. It's very grainy because it comes from a newspaper article, unfortunately, and that's all we have. But at least you get to see Millay on the left, John Reed on the right, William Zorach in the window, if you can barely see those hands kind of in there, and this is part of Lima Beans. This is The Long Voyage Home. That's Ida Rao to the left, George CRAM Cook as they Shanghai a sailor and are going to send him on a ship he does not want to be on. This is The Athenian Women. You see Cook there playing Pericles, and you see Ida Rao there, that dramatic look that she has. They almost have the look of wearing bathrobes, but it's a little better than that. Blanche Hayes did all of their costumes. Here's Woman's Honor, Glaspell's play that closes out the season in 1918, about a gentleman who's trying to protect a woman's honor by not saying he was with a married woman the night that a murder he's actually been accused of doing, and he has an alibi, but he'd have to ruin her honor by saying he was with this married woman that night. So he chooses not to do it. So once his lawyer reveals this in a newspaper article, then all these women show up to say they're the woman. So interesting and satirical play. So then in 1918, we're in the war now, very much so, and we move to 133 MacDougal Street. And there's what it looked like inside 133. At the end of the Provincetown Players' second New York season, subscriptions were up 635, and the company felt that they needed a larger space with which to operate. About the same time, the New York City Building Commission insisted they stop using the parlor space in 139. Just 3 doors down, MacDougal Street was an old stable that had recently been used as a wine bottling plant. They said you never lost that weird mix of manure mixed with wine as a smell inside the building. The Players rented it for $400 a month, putting a scenery shop and dressing rooms in the basement and the offices upstairs. Bench that could seat up to 200 were installed facing a quote-unquote real stage with a real curtain and real lighting above them. To remind themselves that the space was once a stable, a hitching post was left attached to one of the walls with the inscription painted above it, "Here Pegasus was hitched." That was still there when I saw it in 1918. And a plaster dome cyclorama, a pet project of Cook's, and fashioned after those used by European art theaters of the time, was installed in 1920 for their production of O'Neill's The Emperor Jones. This is the theater at 133 MacDougal Street, though many times since refurbished, that is known today as the Provincetown Playhouse. I'm going to show you just a couple of other photos here. Here is Bernice, the first full-length play by Susan Glaspell that was done in 133. That's Ida Rao. That's Glaspell on the right. So you see the sets kind of, going up in quality. This is a photo from a rehearsal of Aria da Capo by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And unfortunately, fortunately, we have Cook take a sabbatical because the young people wanted different things than he did. They didn't want to be amateurs anymore. And so he goes away. When he comes back, it's with O'Neill's Emperor Jones, which of course immediately goes to Broadway and changes their lives forever, because now they were not an experimental group, not being listening to the demands of commercial theater. And then that moves to, after the play Different, and in between, O'Neill for Broadway has written Beyond the Horizon and Anna Christie and won Pulitzer Prizes for both of them, but not with the Players. But he decides he needs to have the Harry Ape a very expressionistic play done by the experimental group before it goes to Broadway. But unfortunately, he manhandles it, and he uses his own directors, his own producers, things that the players had never done before. He completely offends Cook by firing him as the director halfway through. And the reality is that is what ended the players. But I think that if Cook had had more playwrights to develop, it wouldn't have been the end. But it ends up being that. By 1922, under Jig Cook's leadership, the Provincetown Players could boast of having produced 93 new American plays by 47 playwrights. After the presentation of O'Neill's expressionistic The Emperor Jones, featuring the critically praised African-American actor Charles Gilpin, that's not a small thing. They were the first major white company to have a black actor in their lead. James Weldon Johnson claimed that the Provincetown was the initial and greatest force in opening up the way for the Negro on the dramatic stage. A remarkable feature of the group was the unusual large quantity and quality of participation of women, both in artistic and management functions. 16 women playwrights. No company has ever come close to that. In their 6 short years in New York, they had presented the truly experimental American plays, expressionistic, futuristic, and surrealistic plays, plays with often potent political themes, poetic and verse plays, allegory plays, plays that showed the plight of the lower and middle class Americans and immigrants, and the group had launched the careers of O'Neill and Glaspell, both of whom would win numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Glaspell presented subtle yet powerful, complex women as lead characters, and without a pulpit thumping approach, became important as a feminist playwright that bridged the Victorian era with the modern. In short, the Provincetown Players launched American playwriting into the modern era and made a pathway for serious American playwrights to begin writing artistic plays about serious issues. Sorry if I moved too fast, folks. I told you about this much of what I want to tell you.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here. This is a great time to put questions for Jeffrey into the Q&A. And I see, Peggy, you raised your
Susan E. Meyer, I'm so happy to meet you even this way. Being Glaspell's goddaughter, that's just amazing. Just amazing. I know of you. I'm a member of the International Society of Glaspell. And in fact, I've got an article in the new book that J. Ellen Gaynor is doing, going to be an amazing book on Glaspell. So.
Oh, amazing. And Debbie says that she is reading Bette Davis's biography. She also was at the Provincetown Playhouse.
See, this is the problem with having to give you the big picture. I got so many stories. Claudette Colbert in 1918 had her first time on stage at the Provincetown Playhouse. So did Anne Harding in Glaspell's play Inheritors. But Bette Davis was in the 3rd iteration of the Players in a very unusual play. She was 18 years old. And yes, that was her first major New York appearance. Amazing. And went on to great things after that. So
amazing.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Mitchell who wants to know, is there anything remaining of the wharf and building? I remember seeing what appeared to be an abandoned building on the wharf in the mid-late 60s.
No, it was gone by 1923. Storms just tore the thing up. You can go, though. What's really very, very nice is on the east end of Commercial Street there. At 564 is still the Cook Glaspell home. And in fact, some very dear friends are there. And they wrote a play called Tickless Time, which was about using sundial time as real time. Well, the sundial that he created is still in their backyard. It's amazing. And 2 houses down is still an opening. It's a private beach for the Cape Codder Inn, which is across the street. That's where the wharf was. And the home that was eventually owned by John Dos Passos, I can almost say it, it was sold to who became his wife by Mary Vorse when she was just on hard times and needed to make money, and she sold that house to them. And Dos Passos was in there until the tragic accident in which that wife was killed. He lost an eye. They were in a car on their way down the Cape on their way to Virginia. And yet the house, yeah, it's a story. But And the house is still there. And in fact, the pilings from the wharf are still around the bottom of the house. So you can see that much. The house
Wow.
a little bit down the road, the house that was where they did the first plays at the Hapgood Boys Home, a very famous painter, and oh gosh, of course I'm going to forget her last name, still lives there. And they've turned it into 2 condos, but nonetheless, that's still there. But no, unfortunately, it's not there. But we have a wonderful plaque that commemorates the place right there on that beach. And it looks straight out. So it's at least an opening spot. There's like one piling that everybody always wants to imagine was part of it. It's not, but you know, we love the romantic story. So
we certainly do.
That's right.
Joan wants to know if we can get a bit more information on the Aaronsburg group.
Oh, well, that's a whole other lecture. But Aaronsburg, they were rich and they decided they were going to spend their money collecting modern avant-garde art. And they start collecting, and their home becomes a place where people like Duchamp, Max Weber, Albert Glazes, so many of them, Picabia, they all hang out there. Sophie Treadwell was there. Robert Allison Parker was there. Alfred Krainberg was there. So both literary avant-garde and visual art avant-garde were there. And they were really kind of a center for all those folks and a place for them to hang out. And they were helping them. They helped when in 1915, Duchamp came over, they helped him find a play, that kind of thing. So they were kind of part of all that. Sorry, I can't tell you more, but they're right this minute, but
so
it's
cool.
really worth reading. Read Duchamp. There's a new, who wrote it? Calvin. I can't see the last name. It's across on my shelf. There's a new biography on Duchamp by Calvin. T.O. is all I can see of the last name. And read that. It really tells you all about him.
I am going to Google that and put the link in our follow-up email, everybody.
Great.
Riva wants to know, what were James Stewart's roles?
James Stewart, as far as I know, was not part of the Provincetown Players ever, as far as I know.
Okay, cool.
Do you mean as in Jimmy Stewart, the actor? I'm assuming so.
I would assume so.
Yeah, no, he wasn't part of it. Sorry about that.
Cool.
Wouldn't that be?
Apparently, he always listed it.
Oh, well, I got to check that out. Never know. Harold Clurman was who started the group theater. I love that connection. He was an extra, if you will. He always used film verbiage, but he was part of the ensemble of some of the plays in 1927 with that second, or we had 26, I guess it would have been, with the Experimental Theater Company. The next company that was in there, they took a year off. Cook went off to Greece. He never came back. Sadly, he died there in 1924. And so the next group that took over was O'Neill, Kenneth McGowan, and Robert Edmund Jones. And they had a group that was called the Experimental Theater Company because Glaspell would not allow them to use the name. They had incorporated, and they would not let them use that name. And that only lasted 2 strong years. But his plays, Desire Under the Elms, Ancient Mariner, some really good plays were done during the time, so.
Yeah, amazing. Ralph wants to know, any idea if there was overlap or perhaps even rivalries with the Washington Square Players at the church around the corner?
Well, they were great friends. And the only difference was the reason that they became something else, because they ended up performing up at the Bandbox way uptown on 57th or 55th. The reason they just weren't committed to doing American plays. And so that was enough. They were doing great plays and their legacy was awesome. They, unfortunately, when the war started, had to quit because so many of their men left and they had run out of money. And so they decided to end, but it became the Theater Guild eventually. So that's not a small thing. And in fact, they ended up producing most of O'Neill's major plays. But they were all still friends, and many of their actors would go back and forth. Margaret Wycherley, Edward Goodman directed for them. Different people. It was interchangeable while that was going on. But if you're meaning Judson, that wasn't quite. The Judson Church was there, but eventually at the end of it, that was all different. Where we see NYU Law School and Bops and all that. That was all apartments. That was where Washington Square South, Reed lived. The Louis Holiday, Polly's brother, had a restaurant called 60 there at 60 Washington Square South. So
different landscapes.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Carol. Hi, Carol. What was the reason they did one-act plays instead of full-length plays?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One was that's all people knew how to write in a modern style yet. It was a big deal when Glaspell wrote full-length plays. Now, interestingly, from 1921 on, the end of 1920 on, they're only doing full-length plays. And the problem with that is, if you don't like it, the whole night's messed with an experimental play that you didn't like. Plus, they weren't writing those. Now, O'Neill shifted to that after Harry Ape. In fact, he had shifted except for the Harry Ape after the Emperor Jones. But everybody was moving more towards that. But initially, it was because it was the only kind of way people knew how to write the modern style yet. They didn't know how to sustain a whole evening. Glaspell writes two very experimental full lengths with The Verge, which was basically making a woman Nietzsche's Superman, but making it a woman and seeing that people didn't like a woman being the creator and all of that. It's a fascinating play. Listen, when you read the critics, the male critics don't get it. And then Maya Castellan, who was the only female major critic at the time, she completely gets it and calls it the greatest thing that's ever happened. Ludwig Lewison thinks it's brilliant as well, but it's really something because she's she's
incredible.
On the verge, right? Because she creates and she says, and Glaspell's so sly. Her three men in her life are Tom, Dick, and Harry. It's brilliant. Then there's another play about political activism in light of the espionage and sedition plays called Inheritors. That is another dramatic, brilliant play. They were wonderful, but the critics didn't know what to do with something that subtle. And we hadn't yet gotten Stanislavski in this country so that the actors could act the subtext.
Yeah,
both of those things had to happen yet, and they don't happen till the group theater.
Yeah.
But they had to learn enough in Glaspell's place because O'Neill was verbose, and Glaspell instead wrote ... and there were pauses and silences. That was harder to play, right? But that was why O'Neill was famous for his voluminous stage directions. He was trying to tell the actors, this is what you're thinking, this is what you're feeling, because acting didn't have that as part of its technique yet.
It's so interesting. I always wondered about that when I would read his plays, like what was happening with it.
Yeah. Well, so and I'm trying to remember the name of the group of the guys who only performed his stage directions. There was a group a couple of years ago. I think they're still around. That was hilarious.
Yeah, that's great.
They just did that, right? But the reality is he was just he knew that his father's style of that melodramatic acting wasn't going to work for what he was trying to subtly convey.
Yeah.
And yet he didn't know how to tell the actors to do it. And he only believed that Gilpin was the only one who ever got close, even though Gilpin made him crazy because he didn't want to say the N-word, and it was filled in the Emperor Jones.
I would not want to say that either.
Well, and so he would change it when O'Neill wasn't around, but O'Neill would hear, and he would threaten him that he was going to, and he finally did get rid of it. When they were going to do a London tour, they hired instead Paul Robeson, which is ironic because Robeson had turned down the role initially, saying I would never do this as an African American,
So interesting.
And then ends up doing it. Neo-futurist, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. Yeah, amazing. Amazing what they did with his stage direction. So
Yeah. Is there a collection or a book of plays that were produced at the Provincetown Playhouse in any sort of collected way?
yes, one of the best is a more contemporary one that's I want to say it's with McFarlane, but I'm not sure. Anyways, it's called the Provincetown Players, and it's collected by Barbara Ozieblo, Ozieblo. She is a brilliant Spanish scholar on Glassfield. She collected the plays. I'm trying to put one together. There are still plays in my new book. There are 5 plays that I found that no one's ever seen before. Plus, we got Exorcism. O'Neill's autobiographical play was discovered a few years ago as well, after 80 years of not ever being read. So, I found a lot of notes of people's plays and things, but so at least those now people can find up. But there's still a few more to go. So when I have enough to make it worth another book, we'll finish up the collection. But the Provincetown plays, edited by Barbara Ozieblo, she is it.
That's great. And I'm going to put that link in our follow-up email to everybody.
Good. I mean, they did some, versions of Provincetown plays in the beginning. They're very old. You can still find copies of them. And in fact, you know how Amazon is they're happy to make you a Xerox of things like this and call it a book, and you can pay for it. Though some of they were edited by George Cram Cook and Frank Shea, and they're simply called the Provincetown Plays. And there's like 2 or 3 editions of them. So, but otherwise, until Barbara's book came out, we've all been looking at another wonderful one. It's Women Writers of the Provincetown Players by Judith Barlow. That's another amazing book, and with many of the plays.
I love that. Thank you. Howard wants to know, as it seems these actors were doing this as a hobby of sorts. Yes. How did they make their livings?
Lots of ways. So now this is, let me say that there was a divide that happens in 1919 in the Village period. Anybody who writes Village history knows that all of a sudden we kind of get this infusion of youth. And in fact, it's called by many the season of youth. And the 1919-1920 season of the Provincetown Players, where Cook left because he was so at odds with the younger people in the company. He didn't want to lose them as actors, but they wanted to get paid. They wanted to get careers. And this is what changed in the Village. Those who were before that were more the age of Vorse, Hapgood, Cook, Glaspell, and they were kind of transition folks from Victorian mores, wanting a life for purpose. And then once that kind of becomes established, about 1918, 1919, in the midst of the war, and particularly after the war, we get young people who want a career and want success. And so what happens is, so first I say that because after that, what the actors cared about was getting paid. And many scholars, and I believe that it's a huge piece of why they fell apart, right? Because the whole point, and what Cook fought for so many years about amateurism, was they couldn't experiment if they were worried about the commercial side of that, or critics. They didn't allow critics for the first 2 years. No critics. If they could pay for their own ticket, which they had to get through somebody with a subscription, because legally you couldn't go to the box office and buy a ticket. It was a subscription thing, a club, if you will. They do it. So these folks were, it didn't cost much to live in the Village. That was the good part. So these folks were writers. Mostly they were writers. Mostly they were writing articles anywhere. That was the time of the short story and articles. Some were part of the masses, right? The Revolutionary magazine and journal. You get everyone from Millay and Juna Barnes and all of them, and they don't know where to get their next meal. So there was a collective there. They ate at the theater in Christine's. So they created a theater, so a restaurant upstairs, so that people had a place to be. between rehearsals and after shows.
That's so lovely.
So, yeah, well, Cook believed in what he called the beloved community of life givers, a very Nietzschean kind of idea
That's so
that
great.
he wanted to create from that collective. But he knew that if people were counting pennies and who was making what and how much and all of that, that just couldn't exist. However, by that time, you know, the village ideals had changed. The Liberal Club had closed. The bookshop had closed. Polly's had moved to Sheridan Square. Romany Marie's was on her third place by that time already. All, you know, there was a reality happening after the war. While the war's going on, people feel a little more comfortable. Okay, well, I'm not making a lot of money, but you know, it's good. As soon as when the war was over, that just changed. So that's mostly who they were.
Thanks. Well, I can't wait to hear the second installment and read the second book.
I can't either. The first one only took me 20 years. So.
Well, you can't rush great things. So.
Thank you. Well, that's the crazy part when you've been there and you've literally been picking. I'll never forget the summer of 1997 where I was pulling programs from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s out of the slats as they were tearing the place apart. And unfortunately, as a destruction crew, demolition crew didn't know what they were doing, and the entire dome, that was the famous dome that had signatures of everyone on there all the way up to Charles Bush and Vampire Lesbians of Sodom. Somebody kicked it wrong. It was just plaster and chicken wire, and it went through, almost killed the guy, went through the floor to the basement, and
oh gosh,
a big hubble, and was in a dumpster in Jersey before they told us, as we're daily waiting to get in there and take pictures and take it apart and save, you know. And unfortunately, yeah, the demolition part and all of that has been very hard. You know, I know a lot of folks, you know, have really struggled through that. And now it's just the airspace. There's nothing left. It's thankfully still a spot for theater. It's still a spot for teaching. But there were some tough years in there while it was being changed over. So.
Yes. Well, thank you
My pleasure.
so much. This was wonderful.
Feel free, folks, if you want more info, to go to provincetownplayhouse.com. Plus, you can contact me through there. My email is there, and I'm happy to answer any other questions or give you resources and all of that. Love the topic, obviously. So.
That's so generous. Thank you so much. And like I said, I will include all of these links in our follow-up email, along with a brief survey, which we appreciate everyone taking a minute to fill out if you are able. Have a lovely evening. And for you, I suppose, the end of your afternoon.
Yeah, it is. I'm in Phoenix, so it's a little light here. But Susan Meyer, thank you so much if you're still there. I appreciate it. What a nice thing, even though we've met digitally and virtually, I'm so glad to meet you. And when I come to London, I hope you'll let me take you to lunch or something. Okay.
Oh, so great. Well, take good care, everyone, and we will definitely keep in touch.
Wonderful. Bye, everybody.
Good night.